it's wonderful to have you here speaking about the influence of the Dominican order on the English Parliament.
Correct.
Good.
Yes.
Thank goodness. All right. Well, take it away.
That's recording now. Thank you very much, Sebastian. I'm recording, yes. It should pick it up by Sterling. But yeah, it's a great honour to be here tonight, to speak, to follow on from the distinguished speakers that we've had in this Iota Unum series, with the varied and lofty talks, especially recently with Dr. Pink's talk on papal authority. It's a shame he can't be here tonight, although I'm grateful that some of his particular constitutional questions won't be coming my way, but maybe there'll be some other difficult ones, we'll see.
He wanted to be here, by the way.
Yes, that's why I'm glad to make the recording available. But my talk is titled The Dominican Order and Representative Government in England. And one of the casualties of all the disruptions last year was the recognition of the 800th anniversary of the founding or the establishment of the Dominican order in this country in 1221. So there was a whole series of commemorative events planned for that anniversary last year, which sadly didn't occur. But the Jubilee events will continue, I believe, until May this year, and they finish with the feast of the translation of St. Dominic, and actually a ceremony to reinter the bones which were excavated from the medieval Blackfriars in Oxford. So there is happily a recognition of that.
Is that August the 4th or not?
I don't have the exact date, but it continues until May this year, so I think it's in May. But I double check that. But we all recognise the many contributions, hopefully, to English life of the order of preachers in those 800 years. I mean, just before I arrived, I was actually having a pint with Bruno Schroeder in Blackfriars, which sadly couldn't be here tonight. But their imprint is everywhere. But I think there's a contribution, there's an influence which isn't widely known, which is their influence on the first convocations of the English Parliament, which actually, in its recognisable form, first took place in Oxford. The Oxford Blackfriars Hall, in fact, in 1258. And it's my belief that I'm going to share with you tonight that the Order of Preachers had a critical role in the development of this fontal institution, of this essential institution of England. And I would just like to acknowledge that my research was prompted by conversations with Dr. Morello here, and with Dr. Alan Phimister, who I'm sure lots of you know, and then subsequently with Father Aidan Nichols at the Blackfriars in Oxford. So it sort of sent me down an avenue of research, and I uncovered this thesis, which has sort of lain dormant for about 50 years, and I think deserves to be kind of re-evaluated and represented, and that's what I am going to do tonight. So these conversations about the Catholic origins of our institutions and Parliament is definitely within that category. Now, it's my opinion that the events of the last 2 years, particularly, have sort of revealed the fact that parliamentary democracy is increasingly a kind of fig leaf for oligarchy. But nevertheless, as the distinguished English constitution continues to be dismantled and attacked by various revolutionary solvents, it's salutary to recall its Catholic origins in the Middle Ages, because there's much that is admirable and laudable and lovable, including its representative dimension. To give you an example, Today, I mean, the Palace of Westminster, the old Palace of Westminster, was for centuries a royal palace. And when Parliament was summoned, it would meet in one of the chambers or nearby in the Abbey. And the main chapel of the King's Palace was dedicated to St. Stephen. And to this day, when a member of Parliament leaves the house, he bows in the direction of the Speaker. But this isn't out of respect for the office of the Speaker, as we might think. This is because that is the direction in which the tabernacle of the chapel of St. Stephen was located. So it's just one little instance of how Catholic our institutions were in their origin that people don't know about. So I'm going to represent this thesis that originates with a scholar called Sir Ernest Barker from the early 20th century, but I'm going to condition it in a few ways. I'm going to revise it in a few ways. I think recent scholarship has allowed for that, and I think that his thesis has some problematic elements that I'm going to lay out for you as well. But where there is agreement in the Academy and among historians is that the history of medieval Europe testifies that the Church originated representative institutions and then the state adopted them. And that the representative government derived its original form from the Church, which really was an inevitable consequence in a sense, because the documents, the political documents of the king, were drawn up by some of the few people who could write, who were churchmen. So everywhere in Europe, the king's accounts were kept, his letters were written, his edicts were outlined, his laws were drafted by clerics. So the adaptable influence of the church tended to moralize and systematize these political institutions, whatever their form might be. Witness the diverse political institutions of Europe. And we shouldn't shy away from embracing representation. The church has long recognized that since man is a political animal, insofar as possible, it is good for him to participate in the political order. Pope Leo XIII expressed this perhaps most articulately in his encyclical Libertas in 1888. He said, "Again, it is not of itself wrong to prefer a democratic form of government, if only the Catholic doctrine be maintained as to the origin and exercise of power, unless it be otherwise determined by reason of some exceptional condition of things, it is expedient for all men to take part in the administration of public affairs, and the Church approves of everyone devoting his services to the common good, and doing all that he can for the defence, preservation and prosperity of his country." End quote. So this leads on to a reflection on the English constitution, whose ancientry and wisdom and prudence is rightly celebrated to this day. Sir Roger Scruton described parliamentary representation as revealing, quote, "the gentleness of England and the conciliatory nature of its politics," end quote. And as early as 1470, Sir John Fortescue, the political philosopher, famously remarks that England was a land ruled by dominium politicum et regale, public and royal lordship, as opposed to France, who was governed only by dominium regale, royal lordship. But it would be a mistake to characterise the medieval English constitution as it arose as some form of parliamentary democracy in the modern sense of the term. I think this is a mistake. Rather, what arose in the 13th century in England and concurrently in other Christian realms such as Castile, Leon and Spain was a more refined form of representative monarchy. Its development was furthered not by sentiments of democracy, but by feudal quarrels, stemming from, in England's case, the growing incompetence of Henry III. In his work On the Laws and Customs of England, written around 1259, the priest and jurist Henry of Bracton stated, quote, that the king must not be under man and under the king must not be under man, but God, and under the law, because the law makes the king. For there is no rex where will rules rather than lex, end quote. So the purpose of parliamentary institution was to mobilise consent for levies and for legislation. And in answer to the source of statutory law, this scholar Bracton, he supplies these laws, since they have been approved by the consent of those using them and confirmed by the oath of kings, can neither be changed nor destroyed without the common consent of all those who counsel and without the consent of all those whose counsel and consent they have been promulgated, end quote. So the representation of the Commons that this implied did not mean exercise of control over the king's sovereignty, but rather it was a representative character or participation in and under royal authority. And I think this arrangement corresponded remarkably with St. Thomas Aquinas' description of the ideal Aristotelian mixed constitution that he gives in the Summa Theologica. This is what he says: the best form of government is in a state or kingdom where one is given the power to preside over all, while under him are others having governing powers, and yet the government of this kind is shared by all, both because all are eligible to govern and because the rules are chosen by all. For this is the best form of polity, being partly kingdom, since there is one head of all, partly aristocracy, insofar as a number of persons are set in authority, partly democracy, i.e. government by the people, insofar as the rulers can be chosen from the people and the people have the right to choose their rulers, end quote. So the English constitution has rightly, in my mind, attracted many admirers over the centuries, and one of the most eloquent was the French counter-revolutionary thinker Joseph de Maistre, who I think we've heard about recently. And he said that the English constitution was, quote, the most complex unity and the most propitious equilibrium of political powers that the world has ever seen, end quote. And in the same speech he notes that Tacitus believed that this form of mixed government was, quote, easier to praise than to create, and if created will not last long. However, English good sense, according to de Maistre, had continually subordinated theory or principles to the lessons of experience and moderation, which would be impossible if the principles were written. This is the genius of the English unwritten constitution. And my friend, the Spanish jurist, Professor Miguel Ayuso Torres, has commented that the preservation of the medieval political forms in England, at least until our own time, until the Blair Terror, can be attributed to the precious gift of stability, which permits men to order their future and that of their families in accord with eternal laws, end quote. So we have a popular description of Parliament as the mother of parliaments, but I think this epithet, although it's justified in many ways, makes it easy to forget the antecedent medieval assemblies in realms like Spain, the realms that made up Spain, and in southern France, because these assemblies were actually later to decline and actually almost disappear, which wasn't the case in England. So it's important, this is where I'm sort of adding to Barker's thesis, to recognise that the development of the English Parliament in the Middle Ages is a complex phenomenon. It's an incredibly complex phenomenon, and its genesis lies in the distant Anglo-Saxon period, where you have the witan of the English people, which is where the king takes counsel from the assembly of great men, and patronage is distributed, and all these things. But everyone is agreed, or constitutional historians are agreed that the period of its rapid maturation was the 13th century. From Magna Carta in 1215, which made national taxation subject to assembly consent, to Edward I's model parliament of 1295. Those 80 years are critical. That's where the recognisable institution emerges during this greatest of centuries, as Henry Adams said, and that's the period that I'm going to focus on. But there was a larger social architecture which hasn't been acknowledged, given the due that I believe it's due, because it's unpopular among modern thinkers, and that's feudalism. But feudalism manifested the personal nature of political authority, and that's the backdrop for the development of this institution, because nobles, knights, burghers, clerics assert their privileges before the monarch. And Joseph Strayer, the scholar, wrote, "Feudal government was flexible and adaptable, and under favourable conditions it generated new institutions with surprising rapidity." So I would suggest we must be careful of these kind of modern romantic notions of democratic representation. Representation is in its origin more like an incident of feudal tenure than a modern democratic Enlightenment principle. This was even before the 12th century, before the 13th century, where if a lord was to go to a shire or a hundred court, he could by his own presence acquit all the tenants on his domain, and indeed his own steward's presence would also suffice. But if neither of those men attended, then the tenants had to send the reeve and 4 of the best men. So there's a kind of kernel of representation there. Clearly it has the practical advantage of alleviating the burden of attendance for the many. And feudalism was, beautifully, it was intensely personal. And Parliament would come to be conceived of in the Middle Ages as representing communities more than it did individuals. It was a federation of these communities. It was called a communitatis communitatum, a community of communities, brought together by their representatives. And the feudal bond comprises the liege lord taking advice and counsel from his vassals. And I think that this is the obligation, the feudal obligation that King John is seen to violate, that leads to Magna Carta. So Parliament institutionalises this feudal relationship for the whole realm, where aid, in Parliament's case, taxation basically, is given in exchange for counsel. Parliament, in a sense, incarnated the structures that Magna Carta demanded, which itself arose from the arteries and the capillaries of the feudal bonds within the medieval social body. And Magna Carta, notably, doesn't create the rights that it describes, but it just declares them to be part of the ancient law and custom of the land. Talking of personal bonds, the bonds between the House of Montfort and the Order of Preachers are vital to this story. St. Dominic had wielded the spiritual sword during the Albigensian Crusade, with his friars preaching to the Albigensians during and after that crusade, just as Count Simon de Montfort, and I'm called Count Simon de Montfort the Elder, to not confuse him with his son, he led the military effort. He wielded the temporal sword. And they were firm friends and collaborators. We know that St. Dominic baptised one of de Montfort the Elder's daughters and solemnised the wedding of his son, Amaury. Another daughter, Amici de Jogni, persuaded her son to join the Dominican order, and she herself founded a monastery of Dominican nuns at Montargis, and she later became prioress when she was widowed. And then Simon de Montfort the Younger, who is of most fame for his role in the establishment of Parliament, would himself later found a Dominican priory at Leicester as the Earl of Leicester. So from their establishment in England in 1221, more than 801 years ago, the friar preachers had the affection of both the House of Plantagenet and the lords of the realm, who sought to constrain them. And the Dominican John Darlington is a fine example of the ecclesiastical politician who was trusted by all. So you get some historians which try and align the Dominicans with either the baronial party or the royalist, and I think that's a mistake. Someone like John Darlington was a man of great talents, a scholar, a churchman, a courtier. He was chosen as a man of the King's Council under Henry III in 1256, and probably made royal confessor at the time. And this was the time, the critical period, where there was an atmosphere of growing revolt is perhaps the wrong word, but a contention against Henry. And it's then that we have in 1258 the so-called Mad Parliament sitting in the Oxford Blackfriars, which is really one of the first recognisable instances of the English Parliament, which demands the appointment of a commission of 24 men to draw up a scheme for the better government of the realm. 12 of these men were appointed by Henry and 12 by Parliament. John Darlington was selected by Henry and remained involved in political affairs until Henry's death in 1272. The king eventually settles, the king who did settle this constitutional crisis, the Second of Barons' War, under King John's son, King Henry III, was Henry's son, Edward I, Edward Longshanks, who retained the same favour for the Dominicans. And he continued the custom of choosing royal confessors from the order. And it's Edward who institutionalises the emerging constitutional consensus with his model parliament of 1295, where representatives from both towns and shires are ordered to bring with them full and sufficient power, plenum et sufficientum potestatum, from their communities, so that, quote, the business in hand may not be held up in any way through lack of such power. And so by this time, with the participation of all the estates of the realm, by 1365, the Chief Justice of England could accurately say Parliament represents the body of all the realm. So, with that foundation, I'll move on to Sir Ernest Barker's thesis. Who was Sir Ernest Barker? He was a political philosopher, professor at King's College London from 1920 to 1927. He left a wide-ranging academic career, and he himself came from a non-conformist background. But he was a tutor at Merton College, Oxford, where he found himself overseeing a number of Catholic students from the Benedictine and Jesuit halls in Oxford. And one of his most prized students was a man called Cyril, later became Bede, Jarrett. And he acknowledges a great debt to him in his monograph, The Dominican Order and Convocation, which inspired this research. And Jarrett, interestingly, was the first English Dominican to attend Oxford since the Protestant Revolution. But this is what Barker's thesis was: the elaboration of a suggestion made to him by his own student, Father B. Jarrett. And Barker ended up taking note of the many coincidences and points of resemblance between the Dominican and English representative systems, and studied the original sources for every point of contact between the friars and English statesmen. And he was I think, a scholarly enough historian to eventually conclude in a suggestive way rather than a definitive way, and that's the path I'm going to follow. But this is his thesis, basically. That St. Dominic applied representation to the organisation of his order of friar preachers. That Archbishop Stephen Langton borrowed this pattern from the Dominicans and applied it to the clerical convocations of Canterbury and York. And then that the state borrowed it from the church, both the Dominicans and the dioceses. And that the founders of the House of Commons, Simon de Montfort the Younger and Edward I, themselves followed this pattern, who were themselves influenced by Dominican advisors. So that's the kind of genealogy that he follows. Now, it's again agreed among historians that the Church of the 13th century shows a marked development of the principle and practice of representation. We have 3 ecumenical councils held in this century, with representatives appearing in all of them. And meanwhile, provincial synods, this is back when that word was denoted something that was constructive rather than destructive. The provincial synods are no longer composed of bishops and abbots only, but have representatives Firstly, of cathedral clergy, and then in England, but only in England, of the diocesan clergy. And this development of the representational principle is mirrored, is synchronized in the temporal sphere. And that's the period we see the representative parliament fully established by the end of the period, the century. So there are two schools of constitutional historians that I identified in this research who have written about this origin of English representation. And the first school are those that follow the so-called parallel development theory. And they hold that basically the English development of representation is parallel to the development on the continent, but because it's parallel, it's distinct and it can be understood without reference to that continental development. The other school, the adherents of the diffusion theory, argue that the introduction of representation in 13th century England was a spreading of the already existing principle on the continent from institutions in Spain and Italy. Southern France. And I'm going to follow Professor Ernest Barker and present a case for diffusion over the parallel development theory. His book is the only scholarly study of the question, and I think it's fair to say that it's attracted neither widespread approval nor systematic refutation. For whatever reason, it's not really made much of a big impact. But more widely within the academy, the issue of representative bodies in religious institutions hasn't attracted the widespread attention it deserves. I mean, you saw this even in the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta a number of years ago, where the first clause about the liberties of the church being guaranteed was kind of just quietly sort of ignored. So it's unsurprising in that sense. But Barker argues that the Dominican order were the channel by which the principle and practice of representation reached England. His thesis is that the Dominicans gave form to a constitutional purpose, the institutionalization of representation, for the purposes of council, that feudal purpose, consent, and redress of grievances. Now, I'd like to acknowledge that the lineaments of representation and consent in the political life of the realm were forming before the foundation of the Dominican order, most crucially Magna Carta, when the need for consent regarding taxation was established. But that doesn't, I think, discredit Barker's thesis completely. So to say something on the Dominicans as an order, their influence on temporal politics is already well documented. It was interesting that nearly all the popular revolts, particularly in the later Middle Ages, count friars among their leaders and referred to friars and their political ideals. And the heretic, the proto-Protestant John Wycliffe, who relied heavily on the support, the backing of wealthy merchants, he denounces the levelling doctrine of the Dominicans in that time. So they had that kind of reputation. And William Langland, the poet of Piers the Ploughman fame, he said that the priors were promoters of the unrest of the peasant classes. So they already they've had an alignment, shall we say, with the Third Estate. But at the other end of the social spectrum, the Dominicans were royal confessors. They composed treaties, they concerted alliances, they influenced courts. They were the preferred confessors of nobility until the rise of the Jesuits in the 16th century. And interestingly, they're also the only religious order to have influenced the naming of countries. Both the Dominican Republic and Dominica in the Caribbean were named after the original Spanish settlement of Santo Domingo, where the natives of those islands were evangelized by the order. So the Dominican charism is to go forth into the world, turn it to righteousness, and is reinforced by a simplicity of apostolic life. And the influence, their deep social and political influence in the High and later Middle Ages particularly, testifies to the success of this mission. One of the main sources of this period, 13th century, is an English Benedictine chronicler by the name of Matthew Paris, who observes that the myriad of Dominican activities meant that, quote, their whole earth was their cell, and the ocean was their cloister. end quote. But Father B. Jarrett responded that they took this as their boast, what he used to say of them, what was said of them with scorn. So the development of representative and parliamentary institutions is a phenomenon that we can observe across nearly all of Christendom in the High Middle Ages. Indeed, by the end of the 13th century, we have parliamentary assemblies of different types present in England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, Poland, Hungary, and Spain. But the very first recognisable parliament was in the Kingdom of Leon Castile, where a royal cortes, including representatives of the townspeople, was first summoned in 1188 by King Alfonso IX. And this is antecedent to all developments elsewhere. So why is this? Well, the authority of the medieval Spanish kings, such as King Alfonso IX, it rested upon their role as the principal military leaders who were tasked with prosecuting the Reconquista and expelling the Moors, defending the church. As they reconquered more and more land, this had the effect of expanding the subsidiary power of the nobility beneath them. And in Castile in particular, the nobility were too powerful for the king to completely assert his authority, and the cities themselves acted as if they were independent. And famously, the nobles of Aragon acclaimed their king with this formula. They said, "We who are as good as you together choose you for our king and lord, provided that you observe our laws and privileges, and if not, not." That word privileges is the Spanish word fueros, which is part of the Carlist motto, which actually comes to be before rey, before the king. It's Dios Patria Fueros Rey. So that's how important the local liberties were, this instantiation of subsidiarity, basically. And we have the growth of urban municipalities that creates this pressure for representation in the royal cortes. Unlike in Northern Europe, the ciudades were already these self-governing entities comparable with the city-states of northern Italy. The reception of Roman law in the Iberian Peninsula is also important. It provides the legal concepts for the assimilation of the urban areas into the Castilian constitution. And here, means of council was achieved by the idea of a corporation, where a body of persons, because of their common interests, could be treated as a single juridical entity. So corporations would act as legal persons in courts of law and public assemblies, and that's how the towns of Castile and Leon were represented in the royal cortes by procurators. Another really important Roman principle, classical principle, that was influential in the Convention of Churches, the church councils, which have been described as Europe's first legislatures, was the Roman maxim that was taken from the Code of Justinian: quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbari. What touches all must be approved by all. But in Roman law, this was very limited, this maxim. It applied only to really private legal cases in which there were several legal owners of private property, or they shared the same aqueduct, water source, or something like that. It had no political or civic significance. It was the church who transposed and enlarged this principle to apply to ecclesiastical government, particularly with regards to taxation legislation. So Castile-Leon was influenced by this intensive study of Roman law in the 12th century. Now, this is relevant to our story because 6 years after that first royal cortes, that first ever parliament that we can truly identify in European history, in 1188, a young, high-born Castilian, Dominic de Guzman, was ordained a priest, and he was made a canon of the Cathedral of Osma in Leon. Now, we can only really speculate how far the constitutional representation of the ciudades, like Osma, by procurators at court with the power of attorney, would have been widely known, but we can be sure that Dominic de Guzman would have been aware of these developments. And by 1203, Dominic Guzman, who had moved to Languedoc during and after the Albigensian Crusade, had further contact with emerging representative institutions. Roman influence had also endured in southern France, And again, by the end of the 12th century, we have evidence of 2 towns in Languedoc represented at the Curia Generalis of their lord. In 1212, the great military commander of the Albigensian Crusade, Count Simon de Montfort the Elder, himself summons bishops, nobles, and burgesses, town representatives, to a great parliament at Pamiers. And interestingly, one of de Montfort's English knights was Walter Langton, who is brother of Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, renowned scholar and one of the key mediators and possibly authors of Magna Carta, 3 years later. But the Statute of Pamiers is interesting because it's the only constitutional document we have from France that approaches Magna Carta in scale. And it's very similar to the Great Charter of Liberties. It guarantees de Montfort's subjects protection, justice, and respect for established custom, as well as, most importantly, freedom for the church. So there's a common ground that can be identified between St Dominic's actions, the principles of representation in the church, and both Simon de Montfort the Elder and Younger's promotion of that principle in the state. It's indicative of a common adhesion to the same idea, which is an idea always cherished by the church, which is that power is a trust given by the community. And the community is, in a sense, some sense, sovereign of itself, even if the community delegates its sovereignty to a magister. And so given the friendship between St Dominic and Simon de Montfort the Elder, we can recognise the development of this idea. Interestingly, the kernel of the constitutional principle is present in Magna Carta as well. Does anyone know where? Which article?
What is it? Kernel of what?
Oh, sorry, the principle of representation, consent. Article 12, which is the discusses scutage, which is a payment which was made in lieu of the obligation of military service. And it leaves this kind of tantalising phrase. It says that scutage will not be levied without, quote, the common council of the whole realm. But it leaves open how the means for acquiring that common council of the whole realm. So Father B. Jarrett says that the friar preachers' elective government, their representative spirit, was St Dominic's own personal contribution. And it resulted in the order being democratic in spirit, in principle, but aristocratic in connection. And the order of preacher engages fully in its activity in England, advising, absolving, negotiating, and had a powerful influence almost immediately. So St Dominic, within convocation, issues the constitutions of his order in 1220, which established the first systematically representative organisation of a religious order. It's eclectic in form and in content, but it establishes that representative government will frame legislation and elect superiors. Those are 2 crucial things. And the order is conceived as a federal organisation. Each province has its own assembly, the provincial chapter, which itself is represented in the central chapter of the order. And the Dominican houses are geographical units which are akin to constituencies, sending representatives to the yearly provincial chapter, and elective procedure is a natural development of that principle. And Barker calls the Dominican order the most perfect example the Middle Ages have produced of the faculty of monastic corporations for constitution building, end quote. Now, let's consider the religious context of the time. A Benedictine abbot was often a great lord with many tenant farmers, and once he was elected, he held office for life as the pater familias of his community. And the organisational spirit of Cluny was therefore monarchical, with all abbeys being subordinated to the mother house. And the Cistercian structure, or citeaux, was a sort of decentralised aristocracy, where each house was only responsible for its own daughter houses, and there was a single supreme legislative body in the triennial general chapter of all the Cistercian abbots. But the friars are urban and democratic. It's very novel. They were canons regular, but they took no vow of stability like the Premonstratensians. Their first loyalty was to the order, not to the house or the province. So St. Dominic convenes the first chapter at Bologna in 1220, and it marks the institution of this kind of democratic Caesarist government in the mendicant order. Each provincial priory sends 2 deputies, and according to Marie Hubert Vicaire, OP, St. Dominic expressly states that in this major chapter was vested the legislative authority of the order, and that while in session, it would have supreme powers of control and government even over his own person. End quote. So the speech and tone did not come from an abbot or paternal authority from above, but from the general body of representatives below. The officials were servants of the body rather than its laws. And this is, just as a little expression of this, the new friars didn't bow or prostrate themselves in the regular habit of the monks and the Premonstratensians, but they stood always erect. So it's a new principle indeed. And this spreads to other orders, most notably the Franciscans. There's a second chapter in 1221, the next year, also in Bologna, which agrees to establish an 8th province of the order in England in May. By August, 13 friars arrive in London. They thence travel to Oxford, and by 1239, so within 18 years, the Benedictine chronicler, Matthew Paris, attests that a friar has become a member of the Royal Council, and the Dominicans served the king enough for him to say that the preachers and minorites had at this time become the councillors and special messengers of the king. By 1230 you have the first provincial chapter of the Dominicans in England, also held at Oxford, and the organisation we can assume was probably completed. And then you have a gradual growth of representation in clerical convocations among the secular clergy, from bishops and representatives of cathedral chapters to monastic representatives and the expansions of synodic councils, even to the parish level. And a major driver of this ecclesiastical deliberation that was going on was the growing frequency of royal requests for financial grants from the church. And there was, again, this feudal impulse and the quod omnes tangit dictum that bishops sought to meet these requests only with the consent of those who were affected. So as I've alluded to already, that from the very beginning of their order, the Dominicans had a close association with the burgeoning towns of Christendom in the High Middle Ages. This is the period of the flowering of towns, and obviously the Gothic cathedrals are a kind of achievement of that. And Dominican houses tended to be built in the poor quarters of towns, where they could go about their business of outdoor preaching and hearing confessions. And they depended on the generosity of the merchants, particularly for their alms. So they formed a close bond with the people of the borough, the bourgeoisie. Unlike the great Benedictine abbots, the Dominican prior held office only for a limited period of time and was often of the bourgeois class himself. There was an affinity that developed. And their houses spread quickly from Oxford and then London, and soon they were sending representatives to the annual convocation of the provincial order, the national parliament of the order. And the Dominicans had such success in this country that the English provincial eventually had responsibility for more houses than anywhere else in the Dominican world. 68 in total by the end of the 13th century, if you include Ireland and Scotland. So that general chapters of the order were held in the Dominican house at Holborn, just down the road, in 1250 and 1263, and at the latter of these, St. Thomas Aquinas attended as a definitor of the Roman province. So that's before the Dominicans moved from Holborn to Blackfriars. And this elective procedure was naturally developed following St. Dominic's establishment of the principle of representation. So in the critical year of 1265, when Simon de Montfort the Younger summons 2 representatives from each shire and 2 from each town to Parliament, the first representative of the Commons, chosen by the community, the Dominicans fixed that the number of representatives for each house for the general chapter was the prior and one additional representative, known as the definitor. That's who St. Thomas Aquinas was for the Roman province. And these definitors are really novel because they have no other organisational role other than as legislators. And so you have a system that develops, a system that arises of it within the general chapter, a chapter of priors and a chapter of definitors, which is remarkably analogous to the House of Lords and the House of Commons at the same time. So in 1265 you have the representatives going to Simon de Montfort's Parliament after the very custom of the Dominican system of representation. And this happens when Simon de Montfort decides to replace the committee of barons that had ruled following their revolt with a parliament, a true parliament of the whole realm. And I think he was no doubt influenced by Dominican advisors. But de Montfort was overthrown. He was killed at the Battle of Evesham later that same year. But the innovation he made in the constitution of Parliament endured. This is the major change of the baronial party that lasts. And we have to ask why was that? The logical explanation for this would be that the establishment of Parliament was the result of an influence that remained operative after de Montfort's death. And his vanquisher at Evesham, his former pupil, the young Prince Edward, who ascended the throne as Edward I in 1272, was himself a considerable benefactor of the friar preachers, and he was surrounded by Dominican advisors. We then have the first mendicant Archbishop of Canterbury, an ex-prior of the English province, Robert Kilwardby, who very probably translated the Dominican ideas of representation into practice as Archbishop of Canterbury in the 1270s, the same time that Edward takes the throne. So by 1282 we have writs convoking Parliament, summoning representatives from boroughs and from shires, with instruction to have plena potestas to act for their communities. And for Barker, this is the pattern. The pattern of this budding institution was the Dominican one. Now, in the general historical account of this development, you used to have a prevalent kind of Victorian view, which is expressed by someone like William Stubbs, who was an Anglican bishop in the 19th century. And he kind of says that the wise and provident Edward I desired to cooperate with his subjects, and he realised the benefit of democratic government, and that therefore the model parliament of 1295 was created to answer this sort of dormant Anglo-Saxon instinct for self-government. But the prevailing modern view, which you would have heard expressed if you were listening to those commemorations of Magna Carta, is of course materialistic, and that says that the Parliament was created because of the Crown's need for money, which was the immediate reason for summoning representatives. And it is true that by the 13th century, the ordinary sources of royal income had become insufficient for royal needs. You have the development of government administration under Henry II, the numerous wars in Wales and Scotland and France, Richard the Lionheart's crusade, the wastefulness of John's administration, Henry III's administration, which all result in expenditure far exceeding receipts. But when Simon de Montfort summons the knights and burgesses for the first time in England in 1265, actually there's strong evidence that he'd already done that when he was governor in Gascony from 1246 to 1252, which is a neighbouring province to Languedoc. And given his family history, obviously he was familiar with this kind of representation long before the Great Parliament of 1265. And interestingly, one of the barons who had helped pressure King John to grant liberties in 1215 was the Mayor of London. That was a critical individual who switched sides. And so when Simon de Montfort summons burgesses to his parliament in 1265, it's a recognition of the growing importance of urban centres and the dependency of their wealth for support. And Edward I, by 1285, is shrewd enough to recognise that the interests of the kingdom as a whole depend upon the collaboration between the crown and municipal business, the municipal business community. The king needs money, and the towns were centres of concentrated wealth, which were starting to rival the great landed estates. And that's why, by the way, the mendicant friars had gone to the towns. They had the wealth to support their mendicancy. Now, one of the things that Barker omits in his thesis, which I think is really important, is the origins of Parliament as a high court. It emerges as a law-making body, but it's also conceived as a court of law, a final arbiter of questions which could not be settled by local magistrates. And this is a crucial difference, another crucial difference, from every other continental system. It has two roots, as a high court and as the plena potestas of the representatives of the commons, united in one institution. And this partly accounts for the strength and permanence of the English representative system. And the germ of this representation in a judicial manner was already operative as early as the 11th century in local courts. As I've alluded to already, whole communities were customarily represented by a few persons. The county court was seen as embodying the county, and the same Latin word is used, comitatus, county and county court, same thing. So there must have been a theory of representation in existence if there was the fact of representation. So we have this concurrent growth of representation in the Dominican order and in the Parliament. But again, what's novel about the order of preachers is the control that friars have over their officers. And what's new about the King's Council of Parliament by 1275 was this acceptance of national representation, where geographically representative knights and burgesses don't exercise control over the king, but are entitled to deliberate public matters as the king presents them. And this is the means of acquiring counsel of the whole realm that Magna Carta had asked for. And there's a few more pieces of evidence to Barker's thesis that I'd like to also mention, I think, to buttress it. And this Stubbs as well mentions that the medieval procedure of Parliament was similar to that of convocation, clerical convocation. In both cases, there's a list of gravamina, grievances, followed by a similar petition for reformanda, remedies. And the Dominicans also introduced the forms of using elected committee men to prepare legislation and a requirement of 3 readings of each actum before it becomes law. It's all very suggestive. So a sympathiser of Barker, the Fordham law professor, Joseph Constanzo, S.J., summarised the developments well. He said, quote, "The originality of representative governance is Catholic, papal in promotion, religious in precedent and experience, ecclesiastical in the synodal convocations, its growth in ecclesiastical and civil circles mutually compenetrant." Now, there is a serious obstacle to Barker's thesis, and I should acknowledge that. It's presented in the form of King John's writ of summons in 1213, so 8 years before the Dominicans' arrival on these shores. He summons 4 knights from every shire to, quote, discuss the affairs of the kingdom. And this is also 13 years before the first proctors of the cathedral chapters were summoned to an ecclesiastical assembly by Archbishop Stephen Langton. So we're left with the question, there's very scant evidence about this writ of summons except for the writ itself. But we're left asking, where did King John get the idea when the early committees, which I've talked about already, the county court committees who recorded to Westminster never had the authority to deal with anything but judicial matters? Did he learn the principle which is kind of contained within his writ of summons in Gascony, perhaps, where he waged many campaigns? I would sympathise with that. Barker answers that the events of 1226, that's Langton's convocation of clerical representatives, are surely more important than those of 1213, King John's summons, and the lessons they teach is the influence of the clergy on progress in political ideas, end quote. Now, even the critics of Barker's thesis, like someone like George L. Haskins, who argues that we should discard this idea that ecclesiastical assemblies were the model for parliamentary assemblies, even he admits that ecclesiastical influence gave currency to the representative principle and to the Roman law from which it arose. He acknowledges that the ecclesiastical assemblies were an influence, they just weren't the first cause. So to draw my conclusions, I would point to the fact that the representatives were by geographical unit rather than by feudal tenure was novel, and this principle was given highly visible, dramatic form in England by the Dominicans. But it would be a mistake to see the Dominican centralised government, quote unquote, and then subsequently of the English state as an impingement on local liberties. Barker comments that paradoxically, the principle of representation became a safeguard of local freedom and a harmony between unity and diversity. He says, quote, "The representation of the vigorous local life of the Shire, after all the supreme differentiation of England from the rest of Western Europe, finds its counterpart in and lends its support to the representation of the clergy of archdeaconries, orders and dioceses who are bound up to that local life. Thus we should find in the strength of representative principle permeating both clergy and laity, in the strength of a local life in which the clergy share with the laity, in the strength of a national representative institution, expressing that principle and drawing vigour from that local life, the reasons for the nature of the English convocation." Now there's a contemporary historian, constitutional historian, J.R. Madicott, who's at Oxford, I believe, and he's emphasised this idea of Parliament as an evolution, as a continuous process, which has some merit, but we've got to account for this kind of crescendo of the pace of that evolution, if you want to call it that, in the 13th century specifically. And the Dominican development of the representative principle was its highest expression in the whole 13th century in the church, and it's certain that expression, the influence of that expression, was felt in the States as well. So what we're left needing is a new examination of the sources, particularly what happened in 1213. They have been pretty thoroughly studied by eminent scholars like Father B. Jarrett, and it's because of this kind of argument from silence, the fact that everything's quite circumstantial, that these scholars, mainstream scholars of English constitutional history, have neglected the Dominican influence on the representative system. But I think what has been acknowledged is the importance of representative institutions in Spain and southern France before the foundation of the Dominican order. But I don't think this necessitates an abandonment of Barker's thesis as a whole, but it rather suggests that Dominicans may have been a conduit for that influence. At the very least, they served to swell the stream that was already in full course. I'll also finish with a few arguments of my own. The first is that the critics of Barker's diffusion thesis ignore the importance of the organic in history, of organicity, because they're looking for explicit documentary evidence, which wasn't such a priority in the Middle Ages. This is when great enterprises like Parliament they weren't conceptualised, they weren't modelled, planned, and then imposed in a way that they would be with the dawn of modernity. That's not how things worked in the Middle Ages. Personality, family relationships, friendships like St. Dominic and Simon de Montfort, tacit agreement, admiration. This is the way the world worked. And Parliament didn't develop like a machine with cogs that were sort of added, perfectly formed, but it instead like a tree, like a plant. So this is Barker's conclusion. He says, quote, "The study of the institutional development of the Middle Ages is an organic whole. We cannot isolate church and state. Not only do they develop side by side, but they interact in their development. The development of representation in church and state must not be figured in the mind as the advance of two parallel lines in two separate squares. It is the growth of one idea into an institution in that one and single res publica Christiana under two governments, the regnum and the sacerdotium. Further, we must not isolate the institutional development of England from that of continental Europe," end quote. Now, I would say, I would agree with a scholar called Pollard that Barker does undervalue the precedent representation among the laity before de Montfort's Parliament. But he's very alert to picking up on any instance of representation among the clergy. And that I think is an oversight. He doesn't admit the importance of the local life of the Shire, the importance of the local representation in the Shire Court. There is undeniably, by the time of the Dominicans' arrival in England, a growing current in motion towards representative government. Magna Carta establishes the need for general consent to taxation, a vital step towards the establishment of Parliament in the next generation. But I do think it's true that the Dominican example of convocation gave the example and shape to how this institutionalised representation was formed. I think it was a procedural model for how to instantiate those representative principles more fully. So I'm going to end my remarks with the words of a man who I quoted at the beginning of my talk, Joseph de Maistre, and he said this. He said that that the men involved in this diffusion of the representative spirit seemed to be acting without foreseeing the outcome, and no doubt they were guided in their course by an infallible power. Thank you very much for listening.